So we get to chapters 19 and 20. I don't know what you now expect for those who reject grace, who reject forgiveness. Well, there's nothing left but death. That's the subject of these two chapters, death. May not obviously seem about that, but that's where we'll get to. Chapter 19, though, is called Laws About Purification, isn't it? Laws for Purification. It's another chapter of laws, and so just like chapter 15, you need to read it carefully and think about it. I'll do that for you. And what is it about? At first reading, it looks rather useful. It's about instant sacrifice. And people are supposed to make a sin offering with a red heifer. And what they do, they save the ashes. They put them somewhere in a pot to be used later. And then the rest of the chapter talks about cleansing from death. Death is, of course, what makes you unclean, isn't it? God is the God of life, and therefore death is opposed to him. It makes you unclean. And if you read through this chapter, death is everywhere. Verse 11, whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. Verse 13, whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died, and doesn't cleanse himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. And they need cleansing. Verse 14, this is the law when someone dies in a tent. Everyone who comes into the tent and everyone who is in the tent shall be unclean for 7 days. And every open vessel that has no cover fastened on it is unclean. Whoever in the open field touches someone who was killed with a sword or who died naturally, or touches a human bone or a grave shall be unclean. Death. Now, why is this red heifer, these ashes, so useful? Well, verse 17. For the unclean they shall take some ashes of the burnt sin offering, and fresh water shall be added in a vessel. Then a clean person shall take hyssop, and dip it in the water, and sprinkle it on the tent and on all the furnishings, and on the persons who were there, and on whoever touched the bone, or the slain, or the dead, or the grave. And you just add water to the ashes, and you can sprinkle it. It's an instant sacrifice, like instant coffee. That's very useful, isn't it? Saves you a bit of work. But what's the point of these laws? And why is it here? What do we get if we read this in context? Look at the big picture. Well, if we look at the context, we can see that these laws make a lot of sense. Dealing with dead bodies. After all, what was one of the things that happened just before? 16 verse 49. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the affair of Korah. That's a lot of dead bodies that they had to deal with. And so these laws make sense. In fact, it's what comes after chapter 19. 20 verse 1. And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Chapter 20, it starts with Miriam dying, it ends with Aaron dying, surrounded by death. That's why this instant sacrifice is helpful, isn't it? You need to deal with dead bodies, and being able to do that quickly is helpful. But actually it's pretty grim then, isn't it? Dealing with dead bodies. It's grim. And especially if you think about the timing. I mean, where are we in the story? Chapter 20 is the 40th year. Where is chapter 16? Well, there's no timing. There's no movement. As far as we know, we're still just outside the promised land, in the beginning. And people think, well, there seems to be a bit of a gap. What happened in those 40 years? And the answer is, chapter 19 happened in those 40 years. Dealing with dead bodies. Basically, that's all you can say about these 40 years. These laws are pretty eerie and grim. What happened in those 40 years? 600,000 men died in the wilderness, and probably an equal number of women. They died, and there's nothing else to say. Nothing else that happens that matters. Only people dying. In a way, it's so subtle, isn't it? It doesn't give you all the details. It just gives you laws about what happens when someone dies in a tent, and when someone dies in a field, and when someone dies suddenly, and when you touch a dead person. It's very subtle, but it's very tragic. It's a bit like a war movie. You can imagine a war movie, and you know there's a great battle that's going to go entirely wrong. And lots of people will get killed. But they don't show the battle. Instead, they just show something like this, and like these crosses at Normandy. What is the message? Yeah, it's very subtle, but it clearly says what happened, isn't it? Lots and lots of people died. And that is what these chapters are doing. Lots of people died. And that's all that happened. It makes it so pointless. 40 wasted years in which nothing happened except death. It's pointless, it's tragic. But that's the end of those who reject grace, right? Death. Nothing lasting, pointless, death. And chapter 20 is pretty similar. As I said, it's the 40th year, right? We're 40 years in the desert. And what has changed? Well, the big message of this chapter is same old, same old. Nothing's changed. That's the point. This chapter, of course, is surrounded by death, right? The great leaders die. In the beginning, it's Miriam. At the end, it's Aaron. Also in the middle, Moses gets his death sentence. And for the rest, this chapter is basically a replay of chapter 14. A replay of the beginning of the 40 years. How do you get that? Well, first of all, they arrive, verse 1, in Kadesh. The people stayed in Kadesh. Where is Kadesh? Well, that's the place where chapter 14 happens, the Great Rebellion. It's the same place. They've come full circle. And what events do we get in this chapter then? Well, we get grumbling, of course, because the people grumble against Moses about there's no water. And what then happens? Rejection of the Lord. Moses is told, go to the rock, speak to it, and water will come out. But Moses ignores God's instructions. He strikes the rock twice. He shouts, you rebels, shall we bring water? Now water does come out. God is gracious. But what is the verdict? Verse 12. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. You did not believe in me. It's the same thing as chapter 14, unbelief. And the result, he's not allowed into the promised land. Just as an aside, I think this is pretty scary. Right? This is in the 40th year. For 39 years, Moses and Aaron led the people through the promised land, thinking they themselves would go in. And now they fall here at the last hurdle in the 40th year. Maybe some of you here are older saints, and you've been walking with Christ for decades, and you presume everything will be okay. There's still time for you to reject Christ. Don't do it. Don't presume. Keep close to him. But can you see that it's the same as chapter 14, unbelief, that leads to being excluded. It's now Moses and Aaron, but yeah, it's the same event. And we then get that illustrated in verses 14 to 21 as Moses wants to get into Edom to get to the promised land. And he is refused, and they come out with a big army and stop them. It's again the same as chapter 14, not being allowed into the land. This whole chapter, it's just a replay. It's the same place, the same events, even though slightly different people. It's a rubbish sequel. And you may wonder, what's the point? Why do we get a chapter now in the 40th year that's exactly the same as the beginning? Well, that's the point. Nothing's changed. Nothing to look forward to. It's hopeless. There's no change. These people, there's no change. No hope. It's the same. It's a sad end to this generation when nothing's changed after 40 years in the desert. The only thing, as we've seen, is all these people dying, and now we see the leaders die as well. It's the same, no change, hopeless. And so you take these two chapters together, and what do you get? You get the end of the first generation. You get the end of those who reject God's grace. A picture of life under judgment, death. It's life outside the promised land. That's the point. It's all outside in the wilderness. And there's nothing to report, no change, there's no hope, just death. It's pointless and empty, nothing to look forward to. And it's so tragic. It's not just the Old Testament. The New Testament has similar language. Of course, sin leads to death. Hell is called the second death. But there's also the language of being excluded, being outside. Let me read Revelation 22, verse 15 or 14. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and that they may enter the city by the gates. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers, and the sexually immoral, and murderers and idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Being outside, not being in the city. Outside. Outside where it's pointless and hopeless. And yeah, that's tragic. That's hell. Outside. That's what we do in church discipline, isn't it? If someone is wandering away from the faith, in a way we put them outside. We say you're not allowed in the membership. We can't give you the Lord's Supper because your behavior shows you're outside. And that exclusion should be a very powerful message to bring them back. It's terrifying, isn't it? Being outside. It's a horror, these two chapters. So stay close to Christ. Don't reject his forgiveness, or there's nothing left but a pointless, hopeless eternity. Eternal death. Now, why don't you think about that in your groups?